Well, more and more people are trying to do their bit to help tackle climate change. They're taking it personally. But the high costs of environmentally friendly choices like electric cars, these new boilers, leave many wondering if it's just too expensive to save the planet.
Well, following on from the latest report that the UK is still lagging behind on its climate policy, many question how our individual behaviour really could make a difference if the government isn't moving quicker.
Well, we all saw the news pictures last night, and we're joined now by climate activist Asad Rehmen, UN Ambassador for Climate Change Dale Vince, and Liam Norton. These are the pictures I'm referring to from Insulate Britain. That's the climate change activist group which brought the M25 juddering to a standstill for many hours of the day yesterday. And we're going to start with you, Liam. Thanks very much for coming in this morning. Now, this is not a flippant question, OK? I just wonder what makes you and the people who performed that demonstration yesterday clairvoyant. Because how can you possibly know what's in the vehicles that you're holding up for hours? For example, if you just bear with me on this question, how do you know that there aren't parents with a child who's going to an absolutely vital appointment with their cancer specialist? How do you know there's not a funeral cortege and that people are going to their mother's or father's funeral? How do you know that there aren't people going to them is a vital job interview, which might actually be to do with helping to save the planet? You don't know any of these things, and yet you're taking huge risks with other people's lives as individuals. What gives you that right, and what gives you that foresight?
Well, I agree with you that we don't know. So you're completely right. And I don't think it's about what gives us the right. I think it's about what is the reality that we're in at the moment.
Well, what does that mean? Well,
it means that if you... Sir David King, the Chief Scientific Advisor to the British government, has said that we have... what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. Now, you're an intelligent person, Richard, right? Can you read between the lines of what 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity? Can you read between the lines?
And you're an intelligent person who's admitting that they're not clairvoyant. Can you explain to me as, say, for example, the parent of a 7-year-old child who has an absolutely critical hospital appointment to deal with their potentially terminal cancer, but an appointment that may save their lives, and they find themselves sitting behind one of your roadblocks for hours on end and missing that appointment or that treatment? Can you justify that?
I'd be furious.
Well, then why are you doing it?
Because, as I've just said, what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in.
So you're prepared to risk that child's cancer treatment and potentially life, because you don't know. We're talking about many thousands of vehicles stuck behind these protesters. By the law of averages, there are going to be critical journeys that are being interrupted and stopped. Can I give you a definition of something?
Yeah.
And tell me what you think of it. And you are an intelligent person, so I'd like to know what you think. This is a definition: a tendency towards an actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control over individuals, or severe social regimentation, forcible suppression of opposition, and a belief that the greater cause takes precedence over individual interests. Do you know what that's a definition of?
Go on.
Fascism.
OK. Well, I don't think it's fascist to have a demand of universal care. And that's what Insulate Britain are talking about. What we're talking about is the best value for money for reducing emissions per pound spent. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of proper jobs, meaningful jobs. And we're talking about stopping the deaths of thousands of our old people, which is what happens because old-age pensioners have to choose between food or heat. So that's what's going on in the United Kingdom at the moment. But Richard, just let me finish.
I'm coming in on that point, because it's a perfectly fair point, and I've got a perfectly good...
Insulate Britain is about universal care.
Why is it reasonable, in pursuit of those perfectly understandable aims and ambitions, to completely risk the health, the lives, and not just getting to work on time, but the kind of scenarios I've outlined? Why is that a price that people have to pay in order to support willy-nilly your ambitions?
Because who you
fascism.
should... well, if you want to talk about fascism, right, it's using weak people and using lies, and what we're talking about is a truth. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's what Sir David King's talking about when he's talking about what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. What Insulate Britain are talking about is a universal care. That's what we're talking about. And you should get the government on here. You should get the Minister for the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
Well, we have government ministers on this programme every day.
And you should be asking them why it is that they're not looking after the British people's interests. And as soon as a meaningful statement is made by the government. Do you know how many homes need to be insulated and retrofitted by 2050? It's 1.5 a minute. How many are being done? 0. We've got an absolute crisis in terms of what we need to do to decarbonise our homes at the moment.
Is to try and get people to insulate their homes. Is there not a more popular way you could do it than bringing the M25 to a standstill? As Richard said, if even one person in one of those vehicles was trying to get to hospital, you've lost everybody.
Well, this isn't about who we lose and who we gain. This is about
You said that's exactly what it's about.
Well, this is about asking the government to get on with the job, and they're not doing. And that's what this is about. And nobody's speaking about the reality of the situation that we're talking about here.
You've been talking about it all
You've been
week.
talking about melting ice caps, which you should have been doing 10 years ago. But what we're talking about is the destruction of our economy, the destruction of the fabric of our society.
What would you say to
and what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine how this country...
What would you say to the widow of a man who yesterday, and this could have happened, it didn't, but it could have happened, and if you continue with this protest, it could well happen, who died behind the wheel of stuck traffic of a heart attack and wasn't able to be airlifted to hospital, driven to hospital, receive any kind of serious treatment, and died in the car behind the wheel after maybe... It took my father 20 minutes to die of a heart attack. In that time, given different circumstances, he might have been saved. What would you... If we could produce a woman in the studio now whose husband died next to her in the car because they couldn't move, they couldn't get to a clinic or a hospital because of what your guys were doing, what would you say to her?
Richard...
What would you say to her?
Richard, a few years ago, I was on building sites with a tape measure and a pair of pliers, and I've woken up to this crisis, OK?
Sorry, you're not answering that question.
Yeah, no, I'm about to.
All right,
I'm about to. But what I'm saying to you is, why do you think grannies are on the road yesterday? Why do you think that's happening? We feel terrible about the situation that we find ourselves in. This is the way that has been proven to force the government to act,
So
right? And I would tell that person that they need to go and sue the government for their inaction, and this is criminal.
While before they bury their husband?
I would feel terrible for that situation. The government aren't looking after... The government are not looking after their citizens, Richard.
And neither are you.
What we are doing...
Neither are you.
We've got a plan. We've
got
got a plan to insulate Britain. It gives you the best value for money per pound spent in terms of reducing emissions. Hundreds of thousands of meaningful jobs will be created.
And you think that would come from somebody who missed their parents' funeral yesterday because of your protest?
We're going to stop... What we're talking about is stopping pensioners freezing to death.
You're blocking out reality, aren't you? You're only seeing one aspect of reality.
You're in denial of the reality.
You're ignoring the reality of the individual. You're seeing the reality of the state, as it were, and that's fine, but you're seeing it at the absolute expense of the reality to the individual. And that is fascism, I'm afraid.
No,
I think you need to face up to that.
I think you're confused, Richard, about what that word is.
I'm not confused at all.
It's easy to throw around terms and try to put me on the back foot.
Well, of course I'm going to put you on the back foot because
what I'm talking about, what Insulate Britain are talking about is universal care. And that can't be fascism.
Well, there wasn't much universal care on the M25 yesterday.
Well, there was.
No, there wasn't. If you were stuck in the queue, are you going to carry on?
Because
ordinary people
that were stuck in that traffic are in the same crisis as you and me, aren't they? And this is what this is all about. The United Kingdom, this country of ours, needs to understand that we've got a crisis.
So you think somebody who couldn't get to their parents' funeral,
we need to roll up
a serious medical appointment yesterday is going to say it's OK because it's for the greater good? You really think that's what they're going to say to you?
Pardon?
You really think that somebody in some of the real-life scenarios that I've outlined today to you this morning, you really think that they're going to say to you, if they have the pleasure of meeting you, yeah, that was OK that I missed my cancer appointment, that was OK that I missed my mother's funeral, that was OK that the funeral cortege got caught up in the roadblock, it didn't matter because it was for our greater good. You really think that's what they're going to say to you?
Because you want our homes insulated.
Really?
Do you know that there were pensioners drowning to death in Germany?
Yes.
Yeah. And do you know how much rubbish, 90,000 tonnes from the flooding in Belgium? So this is the reality that we're in. It's a really awful situation that we find ourselves in.
Isn't there another way to draw this to our attention?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
This is it. So there's only one way of protesting, and that's to block the traffic.
It's not protesting, actually, Richard. It's called resistance. And when the government are being criminal in their inaction, ordinary people were left with no other option. That's what you see in history. And normal is over. right? And that's what Sir David King means. When he's talking about 3 to 4 years and what we do will determine the future of humanity, you need to read between the lines of what that statement means.
I don't think anybody's
it means the suffering of
the
billions
scale
of
the
people.
Problem. I think people are wondering how you carry people with you when you block the M25 and hold people up for hours and hours at one time. Let's talk to... We've got two other guests on this. Asad Rehmen is a climate activist and director of War on Want, and Dale Vince is the UN ambassador for climate change and chairman of Forest Green Rovers, the world's greenest football team. Dale Vince, is this the way to persuade people to change their behaviour?
Look, I can see both sides of this debate that's just taken place. And I think that in order to bring about the kind of change we need with the urgency that we need, there's a very fine line to be trodden in terms of disruption to get attention from the government to make the point that they're not doing enough, balanced against the impact on individuals and whether or not that actually puts them off the course. I think it's a problem, a fine line to tread. But, we have to do something because there is an urgency. This is a vital decade, actually, to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. And what we're talking about are the livelihoods of millions of people in the very near future. If we don't act urgently and radically, then we're going to ruin their lives. The economy, the country they live in, the whole world is at risk from the climate crisis.
You say that it's a fine line, and if it was simply inconvenience in the way that I would have been inconvenienced yesterday if I was on the way to cover a story and I couldn't get there, that would be an inconvenience, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. You've heard the scenarios, and they aren't silly, high-flown scenarios that I've just outlined to our guest here. That's not a fine line, that's a red line.
No, it's a fine line, because you're outlining emotive hypotheticals, and what you're ignoring is the science that says millions of people will lose their lives, will be displaced from their homes, have to flee to other countries. You're ignoring all of that.
I am not ignoring that because I agree with him. I agree that we should be lagging our homes. I agree with all the measures that we should be taking and trying to find the money, because most people can't afford it on their own, and that's going to involve some kind of tax hike. But I agree with him. I'm already there, but I don't need to see people, and I'm sorry, you may say that these are hypothetical examples, and to an extent they are, but believe me, they are real too. And there are going to be real tragedies as a result of the actions that he's taking. I agree with his point, and I'm not in denial about it, but I think the methods that him and his team are using are completely dangerous. OK, let's ask Asad Rehmen, because you're director of War on Want. I mean, you know about the global impact of this crisis. What's your view about the threat on the day that a very controversial protest like this will have compared to the long-term impact on the government?
Well, as Laura's piece showed, we're in the midst of a planetary crisis. Last month, scientists told us it's code red for humanity. And the reality is, of course, governments have long known that the climate crisis is real, they needed to act, and they haven't acted. And in fact, emissions continue to rise. We're on a trajectory to over 3 degrees warming of the planet, where the real question of the future of humanity hangs in the balance. So the question, yes, have we moved the dial on this conversation? Absolutely. We are having more conversations about the climate crisis. Are governments listening? Well, we heard yesterday our own Prime Minister say we're going to dig more and extract more fossil fuels, but when we should be investing in, of course, renewable energy and public transport. Our government policies are too far away. Either targets are too weak, we don't have policies in place. So what do we do as people? Well, first of all, I think we have to recognise that, this is a structural issue, right? We have an economy that's built on fossil fuels. We have an economic system where laws and rules have been put in place that basically for hundreds of years have said to companies, you can exploit the planet and people to maximise profit and ignore what the damage you do. Okay. And these are really powerful interests. And to shift them, it requires us as individuals, of course, to be ethical in our behaviour, but it requires us to be active citizens, to be pushing our governments to act in our interests rather than the interest of these big fossil fuel companies. Okie dokie.
Thank you very much indeed. You planning more sit-downs on the motorways today?
The campaign's going to be ongoing, until...
That's a yes,
what we're asking for is a meaningful statement from the government that they're going to act on insulating Britain, and we'll get off the roads immediately.
People's day-to-day lives, this is the statement from the government, people's day-to-day lives should not be disrupted, especially on busy motorways where lives are put at risk, and resulting in traffic delays will only add to vehicle emissions. We're investing £1.3 billion this year alone to support people to install energy-efficient measures, and our upcoming heat and building strategy will set out how we decarbonise the nation's homes in a way that's fair, practical and affordable. I mean, just on that one point alone, traffic delays, which add to vehicle emissions, you realise that that's what happened yesterday.
Susanna, you and I both know that that statement is ridiculous.
Well, you've said it's ridiculous. I'm saying that the point about traffic emissions is certainly not ridiculous. Idling traffic, because you've held it up for hours, is not healthy for our air pollution, is it?
Susanna, I'll repeat, you know, you're fully aware that what you've just said is ridiculous. And what is ridiculous is the £1.3 billion of investment. That's what's ridiculous.
So it's true.
We're talking about hundreds of billions, potentially trillions of pounds.
So Susanna's ridiculous because you say so.
Richard, Richard, you keep
listen, you've had a really good
interrupting me.
crack of the whip, and you finished up by calling my co-presenter ridiculous.
Hundreds of billions is what's required.
We are out of time.
Hundreds
really
of billions.
I do appreciate you coming in and taking it on the chin.
Nowhere near what.
Let's cool off.